We all get them, but not.
And I was going to say, are we dialed the number yet to connect with you on the phone? Okay.
It's not fair. Their parents' phone. I don't know how my number was. Down for Christina. Morning, Christina. Morning. I have some.
The number you dialed is not.
Sorry. Okay.
Welcome to the teleconference service. Please enter your access code, followed by the pound. To join the conference as the host, press star. Please enter your. There are 2 participants on the call, including you. You are joining your conference as the host. For a menu of available commands, press star pound.
Okay, I'm going to call the meeting to order. We're going to go directly to Director Walker. I just want to introduce Vicki Walker, who is the Interim Director of the Department of State Lands. And I had invited her to the last meeting, but her schedule didn't allow, and so she's here today. So, Director Walker.
Thank you, Louise. And yes, I'm members of the committee. I think I was out in the rangeland, 490,000 acres of rangeland, which you are well familiar with, and I thought we'd never get out of that truck. There's a lot of rangeland out there. Okay, all right, technical difficulties. So anyway, thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be here, and I wanted to, Louise and I had a brief meeting before we came in today because we have a budget request for $1 million to support the work of the OOST. And it was denied by DAS, Department of Administrative Services, and so we had to go in this week and appeal that and give them some information. So I emailed Louise and asked her to send me your budget, and I have that now in front of me. So I'll be writing back to George Naughton over at, excuse me, at Department of Administrative Services and giving him a little bit more information. What's frustrating for me is that you did not receive any funding at all. Being a former legislator, I know that legislators are prone to develop task forces and projects without funding and expect the agencies to pay for that. And now that I'm on the other side, I see the folly in that. So I still have a lot of friends in the legislature, and I'm sure going to impart that new wisdom upon them. But the interesting thing when I chatted with Louise this morning is this $1 million that you're asking for isn't even all of the money that this operation needs to operate. $1 million is a small piece of it, about a third. And if there is work to be done, you're going to need money to do it. And there is work to be done because the coastal economy is pretty darn important. Being a coastie myself, I understand that. We need to understand what is happening to the ocean and the fish with acidification. We had a crab die-off a couple years ago, or a starfish. That was a starfish die-off. And who knows what species is coming next. So it really is something that I'm glad that the legislature had the foresight to ask you all to get together to look at it. But if they're not going to pony up some cash, it really doesn't make it worth anyone's while because you're not going to get a lot done. You're going to put in a lot of your sweat, a lot of your time, and I for one, I want to tell you how much I appreciate that. Having served in volunteer capacities on committees myself, I know that your volunteer time is extremely important, but we have to put up or shut up. And I think it's really important that the state gets some money behind this project that they found so worthy of to pass in the legislature and to give you that support that you need. So know that I'm behind you and in front of you, rallying the troops to provide some adequate funding to this project.
Thanks. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, and I understand you're going to hear from Lisa Assumption at Parks today, and Lisa's just wonderful to work with. I actually called her one day about the Elliott State Forest. I had an epiphany when I was out there. So if Lisa knows how to get grant money, nobody else does quite like Lisa. So I think she'll be really helpful to the conversation today. So thanks, and I wish you well, and I'll keep you posted.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so let's just quickly do a round of introductions so we know who all is here.
Hey, Christina Volniakowski, trust member.
Louise Soliday, trust member.
Jim Simich, trust member.
Laura Anderson, member.
Anne Friend, DSL.
Chris Costelli, DSL.
Shelby Walker, Oregon Sea Grant.
Andy Lemire, Department of Land Conservation and Development.
Charlotte Whitfield, ODFW.
And providing our IT support in the back is Ted Bright.
And on the phone we have
This is Tyler Jansen from Representative Gomberg's office, and some of you folks are a bit hard to hear over the phone.
so
Everybody just needs to. Yep.
Is that
okay.
better?
So Tyler, can you hear now?
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, that's great. Thanks.
All right. So we need to speak into the mics. I just want to make one opening comment. Emily has resigned from the trust. She accepted a teaching position in Hood River, which makes it difficult for her to continue in as a member. So we have a vacancy, and we're going to talk about that vacancy later on the agenda today in terms of if folks have folks they can think of who might be interested in replacing her. There is an agenda item going to the December Land Board meeting to reappoint Jim, and if we can find somebody for Emily's slot to replace her at that same time. Next up is approval of the minutes from the July 30th meeting. They were sent out to everyone. Does anybody have edits, additions, corrections? If not, is there a motion to approve the minutes as printed?
So move.
Second.
So Jim moves and Christina seconds. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion, any opposed? Motion carries. All right, in terms of, well, I'll skip member updates because Lisa's here and I know she has a 10 o'clock meeting somewhere else. So with that, I want to bring up Lisa Assumption, who is the director of the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department. And as you'll remember from our last meeting, Matt DeVore provided us with the statute that allows the Parks Department to enter into an agreement with a nonprofit organization, and they have done that with the Oregon Parks Foundation. And so Lisa is here to talk about the relationship between the Parks Department and the foundation and how that relationship works, so that we can determine whether that's the model we want to use, and if so, then a little later on this agenda, we're going to have a discussion about draft legislation that we would need in order to allow that to happen. And Lisa, I think, has got a PowerPoint. You're loading it? Okay, while you're loading it, I'll do a couple of updates. So you just heard from Vicki about the budget request and where we are in that process. I'll say I'm not optimistic that the appeal is going to be any more successful than the original request was, but we'll see if giving them the budget and answering their questions. Their questions had to do with what the total budget was and whether this was going to be a recurring request, and whether we were going to hire staff or contract with somebody. And so I provided the budget, which shows a $3.5 million biennial budget, of which we're asking the state for $1 million. I've indicated that yes, it would be a recurring request because some of this is baseline monitoring that needs to be done on an ongoing basis, and there will be a need for a grant program on an ongoing basis also. So we'll see. And I also indicated that we would likely start with a contract employee as a staff person for some number of hours each month, but that we were open to going either direction. We built a budget based on a salaried employee, but we don't necessarily need to go that direction. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa, and thanks for coming.
Absolutely. I think we're ready. Good morning. Lisa Sumption, Director at Oregon Parks and Recreation Department. Good morning, Christina. And Louise, it's pretty nice to be sitting across the table from you. Yeah. I sound worse than I actually feel, and I'm not contagious. I've been sick for about 2 weeks. I'm going to try to keep my voice up as we go through this. But if there's stuff that this doesn't feel like what you want to know, feel free to just ask me questions. I know it inside and out, but I wanted to give you enough information that you had a good understanding of how we've set up our Oregon State Parks Foundation. Hey Matt, can you go next? There we go. So our foundation is a nonprofit, and they exist solely to support just state parks. So they're not a nonprofit that can work with any other organization. They're solely created just to designate, to raise funds for our state parks. Go ahead. And ironically enough, in 2013, we actually had to go create legislation to allow us to be able to partner and work with this particular foundation or any nonprofit organization. So at the time we decided, instead of just focusing in on the Oregon State Parks Foundation, that we would open it up in the event that we ever wanted to do something with any other nonprofit, such as Solve or you or anyone else that we had permission to do so. There were folks questioning whether or not we could or couldn't participate with nonprofits. So now as of 2013, we actually have law that allows us to do that. As I talked about, they're here to help us protect and preserve some of our most special places. Go ahead. They were established in 1995. They raise funds for specific projects. They're really good at raising funds for big projects like the Vista House in 2005. They raised millions and millions of dollars through restorations. Lots of lighthouses. Kamwanchong, if you haven't been to Kamwanchong and John Day, it was a really big lift, and they've been very helpful in places we probably wouldn't have been able to financially fund. They put our very first yurts in Oregon State Parks, but I will tell you, when we started doing these things in the late 90s, early 2000s, we became very, very close, and there was a Secretary of State audit that helped us divorce. So we learned a lot those early years about how you have to keep those nonprofits and those state agencies very clean, because the yurts were an example where they funded them, but they were our assets, and it got really unclear as to who really owned them, and we couldn't articulate very well. So those would be some words of caution if you're going to do something like this. They have a board of trustees. There's 10 trustees, 3 ex officio. I sit on their board with them. So that way, the biggest message I think that I would articulate to you is making sure that if this is something you're going to do, I'm assuming you would be doing it with DSL or someone else, that you're very clear with them as to how you're aligned, because what keeps happening to us over the evolution is the new executive director will come in, get really excited about some new project, and if we haven't mutually agreed to the projects and the goals, you start going like this, and the agencies go in this direction and the nonprofits going this direction, and it gets pretty confusing to the public because the public doesn't know the difference, right? So they do now have a full-time executive director, and they now have a membership and communications director that helps them market, because as I mentioned, they're really good at big projects, big fundraising projects, but we haven't figured out that middle ground where they can be sustainable over time. So memberships seem to be the thing that's helping for now. Go ahead.
So Lisa, are you ex officio?
I'm ex officio.
And
Yeah.
was that an intentional decision to not have the director be a voting position?
That way I'm not a voting position, and it keeps those conflict lines very clear.
Okay.
That I'm not providing their direction, but we certainly need to be aligned.
Okay.
So they're doing things for us that we generally can't do for ourselves. Probably one of the, they do things around hiking, and they've done a lot of like bike pods and things like that. But one example is one of our big initiatives is working with different communities of color and different communities that haven't generally, when you look at our demographics, our visitation demographics, they're almost all primarily white, and we don't really have a lot of interactions in our state parks with different communities of color. So we've been working with them in different underserved communities to try to figure out how to get more folks out into the parks. And so go ahead and go to the next one. Hopefully that's my first one. Yeah, go again. One more. So we've had them do things like bike pods. So these are things that visitors are asking for, that they say this would help enhance parks. It's probably not something we had on our master plans, but we're piloting them in certain areas where there's hiker-biker sites that come in, and then there's lockers to lock up their stuff. There's a little tool station where the biking community can replace a flat tire or some little parts here and there, and there's charging stations so they can plug in their things and go along. So this is helping more. What we're hearing from different communities that haven't participated with us is they want longer social connections. They want to keep, get on a bike or hike and go for miles at a time. Go ahead. That's another example. It's very much a communal thing where we normally generally have like a tent site and an RV site, and that's our traditional camping. This is more of a communal type setting. You might get to know, if we were biking and didn't know each other and we ended up here, we might become best friends for the next 20 years because we had this experience together. The Oregon Coast Trail, Salmonberry Trail has been another one we've been focusing in on, some of these places that you can make these longer connections. So it's things that they can just go do without us having to get in their way. Go ahead. This is the big one. So in that inclusion work, we realized that there were gaps. We do a lot of interpretation in our state parks, but we couldn't get, the school districts have reduced their funding so much, they couldn't get kids to the park for field trips and tours and interpretive experiences. So I can't, as the agency director, I can't necessarily go to PGE or a private sector partner and say, hey, could you give me money to put gas in the tank to get these kids out to the park? This nonprofit arm can. And so go ahead, and we have now, I believe we're just over 10,000 students that we've been able to get into rural communities, that we have served kids in schools that would never have been able to get to do these field trips. They're just not the priorities for schools any longer. So the really great part about having this nonprofit is to do the things that we can't do. They're things that connect to our mission, but we just don't have the ability legally to go out and have these conversations, but they have the same outcome we would be looking for from the agency mission perspective. But this is probably one of our biggest,
Excuse me.
bless you. I didn't give you that. So this is probably the coolest project we have going on right now. And we didn't think it would be we thought it'd be a few people here and there, but it's one we can't keep up with, and we can't turn away sponsors fast enough. Everyone wants to give to this program.
Lisa, what is the connection with the outdoor school and the outdoor school ballot measure that passed?
So the outdoor school is has its own nonprofit. So we would be a facility that they could use, but we're not actually the mechanism for outdoor school. Okay. So outdoor school is going to look at whether or not they want whatever type of natural resource experience they want to provide. So they might come into one of our parks. They might want to be on forest land. They might want to be over on the coast for a different experience, and so they don't want to be locked into one location. So we would just be a partner in the conversation. This is also from Ticket to Ride. The best part in this is that the teachers actually, you're good, this is also part of Ticket to Ride, is the teachers come out with them in a lot of our interpretive programs. We are the ones resourcing it. This is actually helping us because the teachers are coming and they're providing the curriculum instead of us. Go ahead. Cottonwood Canyon Experience Center, they were able to raise $600,000 for the Experience Center. Has anybody been to Cottonwood Canyon yet? It's right out in the John Day, probably 20 miles north of Condon. I think what else is it? Biggs, Condon. It's out in the middle of nowhere, but it's our largest. Well, Silver Falls is the largest, but darn close to the largest state park. And then they added new new cabins to the park. Right now it's a pretty new park without a lot of amenities, but we partnered with Eastern Oregon University and all the local school districts for the 2 counties out there. And go ahead and go to the next picture. The experience center is all open air. You can close the doors for experiences when the wind's high or the weather's not cooperative, but there's a whole education experience, which also could be used for any other event. People could go ahead and reserve it. And then there's 4 cabins. I think there's a photo of that as well. That's experience centers. Okay, there's 4 cabins right there too. Yeah. So then, you know, you couldn't host a whole outdoor school, but you could certainly get, and we have a full campground there as well. So this added on to what the park experience already offered, but it was something that I don't know that we would have been able to do because they were able to bring private and public and other resources together to raise the funds to do these types of activities in our parks.
In that landscape, those cabins look like they're dollhouse.
I know, right? And they're so new. They haven't even gone online yet. It'll be, I think next week they'll be reservable, so for the public. Pretty neat. Go ahead. Vista House, as I talked about, they did a lot of restoration. I think it was over $11 million. I think the elevator cost us darn near that much itself. They did a lot. Without that arm to be able to reach into private sector donations and to be able to bring those funds into the organization, we have a lot of very special historical places that we would never be able to preserve at the level that we do without this arm. Go ahead. And it also turned 100 this year. So we had our big 100 celebration, and they put on the biggest party ever because, again, they can go get partners that we probably couldn't get. So it's a great.
And they can put on a party that you can't put on.
Exactly. I'm like, oh, wow, I don't even want to see what's on those wine bottles. There's a label that says what? Go ahead. And we've all been there. And so, you know, I guess I don't know how much you really wanted to get into, Luis. You know, because it all looks pretty when you look at pictures and you talk about projects, but I mean, it doesn't come without its challenges, right? We have to, the executive director and their board and our commission have to stay very closely aligned. We meet 4 times a year with our commission chair, myself, their executive director, and their board chair. And we lay out an annual plan, and we have to continually stay focused on the annual plan because what will happen is we'll lay out, here's the 5 projects we want to complete for the year, and then some other grandiose idea will come up and the executive director is like, but I want to go do this solar thing. And it's like, let's get back to the list. We got to focus here. So just trying to stay aligned is probably our biggest challenge. And so it takes a lot of communication, a lot of vision sharing, a lot of communication. We've had to in the last 2 years because the executive director we have is so energetic. We've really had to create like a single point of contact. Every time you have a new idea, it needs to come through me to make sure that we're on the same page before you start engaging staff. And we were probably 2 years ago closer to, if you just want to reach out to staff and ask for that report or get this data, go ahead and do that. And then pretty soon I'm like, I got 20 things, you know, taking up about 40 hours of staff that I probably would have said no to that project from the beginning if I had known. So communication is probably the biggest thing, and staying very clearly aligned strategically, because all of a sudden if they're out in front of you or you're out in front of your partnering agency and you're not on the same page publicly, then we've had to legislatively answer for that when there were projects going on that I didn't know about as the director my first year, that I was like, oh wow, now I have to answer to that in my budget presentation because you just built this beautiful facility over in Eastern Oregon, you know, why do you need this money over here for this? And it's like, oh, wait, our partner did that. But trying to keep those lines very clear was probably our biggest challenge. So we have to adjust a lot. I mean, we have to, you know, sit down and explain the why. And as the nonprofit perspective, if Seth was sitting here in front of you today, he would tell you the hardest thing that's been for him in this partnership is really truly learning who we are, how we operate, and why. Because he gets so frustrated with the bureaucracy of how government works that he's like, well, why can't we just do this? And it's like, well, he's like, but there's not a law that says we can't. Well, there's not a law that says we can. So we have to have a lot of those dialogues. So from a nonprofit perspective, the biggest advice I would give to somebody coming in behind him is make sure that you really learn the organization you're supporting and what their operational needs are, how their operation functions, and how you can serve them and support them. Not because like during the eclipse he wanted to go create this merchandise line, which we were doing at the same time, but we had to go through state procurement processes, and pretty soon he was selling t-shirts before we were, and I'm like, now we're competing with each other. And you know, if you would have talked to him, he's like, yeah, but I wanted to go show you how fast we could do it. That's great, but I need you to slow down and stay with me, not go show me. I know how to do it. I just have a lot more hoops to jump than you do. So it's been a lot. I mean, and thank goodness I have an executive director that's willing to sit down and be patient. And I keep telling him, don't lose your energy, because your energy is what's going to get us going. And don't take no as it's the final answer. Right now it's no, here's the whys, and let's see how we can get around the whys. So I think that's, I don't know what more you wanted to know, or...
So can you go back, I think maybe even to one of your first slides where you talked about the legislation that enabled you to work with a nonprofit like the Oregon Parks Foundation? Because that's really important to us. We're not an agency, but we're not a nonprofit. And we can't really raise money the way that we are structured right now.
Okay.
But we don't have legislative money either.
So Lisa, just so you understand, in this case, we're looking to enter into an agreement with a nonprofit. We're not the nonprofit. So, and we've been talking to the Oregon Community Foundation about relationship with them, and ran into advice from DOJ that says, you statutorily, money coming to the trust has to go in the state treasury the way the statute's created currently. And we have folks who I think would give a charitable donation if they can get the tax write-off, and you don't get that by writing a check to the state treasury.
Yeah.
So we're trying to figure out how to address the statutory constraint that we've got. And Matt DeVore from DOJ had sort of directed us to your statute because it's seems to be right along the lines of what we need to do.
We'd be happy to share our legislative concept and all the work that we did to get here. We thought we had permission, and we've been doing it for years.
Right.
And then, and it wasn't the foundation that became a problem. It was another nonprofit that somebody questioned why we were partnering with them and pointed out we had no legal authority. And then we went, we don't really have legal authority to be partnering with the one that exists solely for us as a 501(c). Okay, we probably need to address that. So we have been doing it since 1995, and it was 2013 before we actually fixed it.
So did the department actually set up the foundation originally, or did some, okay, interesting.
Yeah, that's why it had to get decoupled, because the organization created it solely for that nonprofit arm for things that they couldn't do. And it was at the time that the budget, it was kind of right after the split when we came out of ODOT and became our own stand-up agency. And so constitutionally dedicated lottery funds came in, and I think the assumption by some was that the general funds would stay, the lottery funds would stay, and it would be more than what they had, where the lottery funds were infused, general funds were taken away. So the nonprofit came in as kind of the save of the day. I think it was the director's idea at the time. And it worked for many years until all of a sudden people started questioning, why are they, how can you take money from them, and what does that look like? And at that point we had been for quite some time.
So I think I remember there were they have 3 ex officio members. Are they all state employees, or are they?
One more. Oh, the other way. I think it's 2 after that. So the 3 ex officios is myself, one of my OPRD commissioners, and then they have
so somebody from your commission,
somebody
too.
from my commission. Yeah, we changed that 2 years ago when we restructured the bylaws, so that way I had a commission member sitting there at the same time, because it's hard enough for me and the executive director to stay in link if I don't keep my commission on board, and you've got the wrong people having the wrong conversations, it gets challenging. So I sit there, the commission sits there, and then they generally have an ex-board member that has the historical perspective. We've tried to keep somebody on that can bring the history as to why they did things in the past. So
Got it.
They have several subcommittees right now that are working on different fundraising ideas for sustainability, that they're trying to figure out how they, because their biggest challenge is then how do they stay sustainable over time. And now, like with Community Foundation and Meyer Memorial Trust and some of those others, we've had some struggles because of how they were designated, and we've had to go back and have them redesignate themselves as a different type of 501(c), so that way they can apply, because the way they were designated was more like a government nonprofit. And I think Meyer Memorial Trust wouldn't give to those types of entities. They're very specific about what type of 501(c) you have to be in what letters you're incorporated under. So that'd be another thing you probably want to look into up front, rather than we spend a year trying to figure out how to get them where they needed to be able to do the Cottonwood project because of the donors we were looking to partner with.
So does the board of the they have to operate independently from the department?
Right.
So they have a budget and they make the decisions about what projects they're going to fund. Mm-hmm. As an agency, you're providing some advice and input to them, but ultimately they make those decisions, not the department.
Correct. And they could go, I mean, in reality, they could go do what they want to do.
Right.
And that's been the risk, is depending on who the executive director is, you know, that relationship is the most important piece, because they are a nonprofit. They do solely exist for their own purpose, and they could decide they want to do something completely different. It gets really hard when we're out of alignment, but you know, we've gotten that much more structured. So we sit down at the beginning of the year, they bring their list and we bring our list, and then we walk away with our list. And there's winners and losers in both of those lists every time. It's things that I want done, things that they want done, and they need something bigger and more high profile. And I'm like, but how do you make sewer system replacements sexy and fun? It's the stuff I need done. And I'm probably not going to get REI to write a check to replace the sewer system. Nobody likes to talk about poo other than parkies, I guess. Right. So it's that kind of stuff where, you know, it's like, these are my bigger needs. I mean, Fort Stevens is operating with a 50-year-old, you know, water treatment or sewer system, and I need that replaced, and they want to go build new facilities, and I'm like, but I can't maintain the ones I have. So those are the kind of dialogues we have of, you know, how do we meet both of our needs, and then publicly, you know, they have to have something that's going to appeal, but yet, you know, the needs that we have are different. So
What are the administrative costs of the foundation? Is it like a 10% approximately?
So that's what, that was one of our interesting things our last budget cycle. They came in, the former executive director came in unannounced and said he was going to come in and testify for our budget, and he testified that he was neutral on our budget, but then also testified that they took 25% administrative overhead, which is significantly higher than any other nonprofit. So that's when we went back and restructured and made sure that we and a commission chair and other folks were there and said, you need to get that down less than 10%. So that's still their goal. They're not there yet, but right now it's 25%. So it's really hard to write a tax donation knowing every quarter of your dollar is going to people's staff. So that's why they need something more sustainable for the long haul.
And so right now they have 2 staff?
Yeah, they have 2 staff.
2 staff, okay.
One full-time, one part-time.
Other questions?
Laura, you look really puzzled.
I don't know if I'm understanding something. So if I understand what you're saying, the foundation can set its own agenda, and I think you said, you know, they can do what they want, but I'm having a hard time seeing how that would work in practice, because you're the sole client for them. They have no jurisdiction to act on park property without the commission and director approval. So they don't have that much autonomy, do they?
So here's how one of them played out, is the Ticket to Ride program. We talked about what a great idea it was, and they rolled forward. And pretty soon I had 365 kids at a park, and it was like October. I had no seasonal rangers on. I had nobody to receive these kiddos, and here they were. Because the foundation thought it was a great idea, they got the money, they were able to get gas in the tank and get the kids in the park. They didn't feel like they had to call us forward. The parks are open 365 days a year. Why couldn't I just send those kids there? I'm like, well, that's great. They're here, but I can't give them the experience they're looking for, and we both lose here now, right? Because this great program now is going to look like we're not ready to deliver and implement. So it's more of those kind of things. They wouldn't have been able to build Cotton Canyon.
They can't go build a yurt or something.
They could go raise funds for it and force me to have to do it. That's where I would get sideways real quick, is if all of a sudden they were fundraising for something that I wasn't aligned to. I would end up building something that I may not have legislatively already gotten, you know, a green light to go do.
Yeah.
And we started that with Cottonwood because it was the former director's priority, and I didn't realize how far down they were. And all of a sudden it was like, I have to make this my #1 priority because it's already rolling.
Well, I appreciate your coming and talking about that, because as obvious as that may seem, that's just the reality. And especially in our situation, I think it's even more complex because we're set up to to potentially fund multiple entities,
Yep.
not just a single state agency, but also universities or NGOs, nonprofits, what have you. And so
Yeah.
we're, we, I think, did a really good job early on identifying those priorities, those funding priorities for guidance to
Right.
keep us aligned. But when it comes to identifying projects, we have a lot of work yet
Yes.
to do. So, but we're gonna have some time.
So ideally,
Because
I
we're
mean,
not gonna have any money for a while.
with
But
where
I
you are
appreciate the
and where
message.
I would like to get to be is you go out there and you talk holistically about the goals and the needs, right? And get donors. I can't imagine you're not going to get people to donate to any of those things that are on your project list. But what I would like to do as the organization is I would like to do it more like a grant application process where they go raise the funds for things like, right, things like the Vista House, things like a Silver Falls Ranch Lodge, you know, whatever that big iconic thing that people will want to donate to. And then I would come to the nonprofit and I would apply for a project when I was ready to do it, when I have the legislative support to do it, when I have the staffing resources to do it, and when the time's right. I'd like to get to that level of partnership. So I guess my best advice to you, if I could get to my future self to be able to fix it, is to have that laid out some way structurally where that way it drives that agreement. It doesn't, you know, because what'll happen is they're all priorities to somebody, right? And then they get conflicting. And so whatever you can do to have some competitive process that everybody gets to participate in and agree upon that this is how they rank or how you somehow satisfy that they are your priorities. And so if you've got the time to think about that before you have money, that's probably a better way to get yourself structured. We'll be there in about 2 years, but we've got stuff we've got to finish up first.
So you have a written agreement between the department and the foundation. So can you provide Chris or Ann with that to share with the trust?
Yep.
I should have thought of that ahead of the meeting.
Okay.
Because we have a draft agreement from OCF and DOJ is concerned about that. And OCF has their own decision-making process, and we would be advisory to them, although they would, their role really is, as described by them, is really to make sure that the organizations that we're recommending grants for are legitimate 501c3s and aren't in fiscal trouble and have, you know, financial accountability and those sorts of things. So it's more dotting the I's and crossing the T's in terms of making sure that the money is going to be spent for the purposes it's supposed to be spent, as opposed to second guessing recommendations we might make after going through a grant review process and recommending that these 6 grants get funded through the OCF
You're more
fund.
about following the money and making sure the money's accountable.
Right.
Yeah, so I'll get you a copy of the agreement that we have with them, and I'll also get you a copy of the annual agreement that we have where we project prioritize list and all that good stuff.
Great.
And the ledge concept stuff with a contact name.
Yeah, we have the
you have
legislative,
that? Okay.
we have your legislation, we got that from
Okay.
DOJ at the last meeting, so that,
And if you, as
that was
you're
helpful.
traversing through that, if you need help, staff that created it is still there, so we can help you with
Okay.
anything you need there.
great.
Louise, can I ask one more question?
Yeah, sure.
while we, have you, so, the legislation allows the department to go into agreement with other nonprofits, not just the foundation. Since the foundation has been created, are there examples of people that want to give directly, outside funds that want to give directly to the treasury for the parks rather than through the foundation?
Surprisingly, I mean, even without the foundation, we can receive donations and they're tax deductible. The agency can receive them. They do go in Treasury State Fund, but people can dictate where those funds go. Like we'll get like a bequest that'll say, you know, this can only be used because my great-grandfather loved, you know, Shore Acre State Park, and we want to make sure those light shows happen for the next 20 years, and here's a donation, and we literally have to make sure that that donation goes directly to that park and that activity. So it's possible. It's a little extra work from an accounting perspective to do it that way. But things like Solve was a partner that is a nonprofit we've partnered with for 50 years, and we didn't have statute authority to be doing the beach cleanup or some of the river cleanups that we do or any of those things. This also allowed us, because in that statute, we also created the ability to work with private sector partners. And so look, REI, we do the Black Friday. We waive all the fees in state parks on Black Friday so people can opt out of shopping and take a hiking day, or do both, shop in the morning and come hike in the afternoon. But that allows us to partner directly with those donor organizations that want to provide to our mission, where we couldn't have done those things before because they were a private sector. It would have required a procurement process to do that. This gives us the ability to accept donations from private and public sector.
So, my understanding was that somebody writes a check to the Treasury, it is not tax deductible under the charitable contributions.
Ours are tax deductible, and I worked at DHS 20 years ago, and people would donate to a music program for foster kids, or, I mean, those were all tax deductible too, so we should check into that.
Yeah.
Because they would all have to go into a state account, but we have to write letters back to them so that they have them for tax purposes. And
which would negate the need to enter into a relationship. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, but
yeah, I'll help you with some of the other examples if you
okay,
would like, because
that would be really useful.
Yeah, we get them all, and there might be a $50 donation when somebody dies, or some people just donate their entire land to us, or property. We've got a lot on the coast where people will do that because they don't want their neighbors to develop it, so they'll donate their land to us, and it's certainly a tax write-off.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So I don't even know who you asked that of.
Let me ask my team.
Okay.
And see if we did something special to do that. But I know when I was internal auditor at DHS back in 97, 98, 99, that time period, they received donations all the time that were tax deductible.
One possibility might be a business or an entity can give money. It may not be tax deductible as a charitable donation, but they may consider it a marketing expense or some other kind of
so
a legitimate expense.
So they can write it off their taxes,
That's
but not as a charitable donation.
Right, it might not be charitable,
Okay.
it might be something else.
That would
but
make more sense to me.
that's just one
Yeah, and I don't know all those laws
possibility.
inside now, but I know we receive donations all the time that they're definitely tax deductible.
Okay. All right.
But
That's-
having the foundation actually is a proactive fundraising arm.
It's so
Right.
much easier because, so here's the deal, right? I mean, even if we get those donations, they're because people wanted to do it, they sought us out. It's not like we're out there marketing or getting people to even know that we could be a potential opportunity. I mean, even with the donors and start talking about, you know, what does your living will look like? What do you want to do with your money? What kind of things do you want to do? It's not something a state agency would generally do, so a nonprofit can actually market that, which is way better for us. I don't have resources to do that.
So if you come in contact with those types of people or potential donors, do you direct them to the foundation most of the time, or do you just?
It depends on what the situation is, because if it's a donation or it's a land donation or something like that, I don't, just because, I mean, there's an administrative cost. I can't charge an administrative cost, so sometimes the donation is actually more significant to come to the agency. So when you were saying that earlier, like, that's confusing, because there are times when I think it's more beneficial for it to come to the agency than the nonprofit.
But you have the flexibility.
To do both, yeah.
And yeah, in the case of the Oregon, the nice thing about the Oregon Community Foundation is they're managing $500 million
Right.
in assets from folks who want to give to charitable causes and have folks that may be interested in funding ocean research and monitoring, and so
They could write one check for 5 different things all at the same time. And
Right.
It's not,
yeah.
much different scenario.
Wow, it's super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? We'll let you go so you can get to your
Okay.
10 o'clock appointment.
Get to go meet with Senator Courtney's staff and talk about recreational immunity.
Okay.
I'll send
Oh,
the stuff over to you, Chris. Thank you. Good to see you guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.
thanks, Lisa. Okay, and then I just, a couple other updates for folks. I did go to the Oregon Coastal Economics Summit. I was a bit disappointed about, with all the carbon discussion, it was mostly focused on forest and not so much on ocean. Jack Barth was there and talked a little bit about the ocean, and Francis Chan was there and facilitated a panel. But it wasn't as heavy on ocean discussion as I was hoping it was going to be. It was worth going for that first day, for sure. I just would have liked to have had more discussion around the impacts on ocean. I did attend the Sea Otter information symposium last week. Really good. The Alaka Alliance was able to bring in folks from Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, and California to talk about their experiences with reintroduction, and learned a lot. And I think this is just the beginning of gathering information and starting a conversation about whether to reintroduce in Oregon and what that might look like, and what the pitfalls are, and how not to do it and how to do it. But just really interesting information in terms of impacts on the ecology of the nearshore environment with sea lions there, sea otters there. And I expect there will be more opportunities for learning and sharing information with the other states and with BC about their experiences. And then I am going to 2 meetings next week on Friday and Saturday. The Oregon Coastal Ocean and Coast and Ocean Information Network is meeting on Friday. Jim has been serving on their steering committee. And then on Saturday is the State of the Coast Conference, which Sea Grant and others co-host. And all of that's happening in Coos Bay at SWOC, the Southwestern Oregon Community College. And it's 2 full days of meetings and other events at the State of the Coast Conference. So I'll be doing both of those. And I think they're both still open for registration. So if others are interested, you can go online to either of those and register. There's a $40 registration fee for the State of the Coast Conference. I think the Aucoin meeting is by invite only. They've got a small room that we're meeting in, so I think it's limited to those who are on the invite list. Okay, so I want to now talk a little bit about legislative change. I do want to follow up on this concept of there's a way to write off from your taxes by writing a check to the state, although I suspect that Laura is probably right that it's a business expense that they get to write off as opposed to a charitable donation. But we'll do some follow up. We may need to ask DOJ that question, or I don't know, somebody at State Treasury. I mean, it's an IRS definition of a charitable contribution, so it may be somebody more with an accounting background or somebody in business transactions at DOJ. I don't know, Chris.
Yeah, I can look into it. I can start with Matt, and of course we
Okay.
know Steve Shipsey, and we work a lot with business transaction services.
Okay. All right. It would be good to check that. So in looking at the parks statute, there is, the opening line to the statute is that it allows the Parks Department and the director to enter an agreement with a private nonprofit organization. So it doesn't specify, and I like that in terms of being general, because it may not be OCF, it may be somebody else, and we may want to enter into agreements with more than one nonprofit at some point. And there's a requirement in here that they provide a copy of the draft agreement to the legislature and also post it on their website for a period of time so that people can weigh in on that. So there's a process set up. And it also allows the director to provide advice and can get advice from that nonprofit organization. So this relationship that Parks has developed with the Parks Foundation is allowed to happen. And that's sort of the way OCF's is set up, so that it's called a donor advised fund for a reason, because the donor gets to provide advice. In this case, we would be considered the donor, although technically we're not, but the money would be coming in to support our work. And there are some restrictions in terms of the director's not allowed to serve as the chair of the board of the nonprofit, the stuff that you need to do to eliminate the conflict of interest issues. They're not allowed to, it says they can't vote for or appoint other members of the board. So serving in that ex officio capacity is the only thing that you really can do. Exercise control over the finances of the organization. So it really makes sure that the two stay independent from each other and are not able to directly control. In this case, there's statutory provisions about access to the department's properties. So probably not something we need in a statutory fix that we'd be looking at. There's also a provision about the department, in this case, the state agency is able to provide supplies, personnel, and other services at cost. So there's a direct compensation to the Parks Department for what it might be contributing. I'm not sure how that works, and it's probably not too relevant to what we're talking about doing, because we would not be, we don't own properties, and so it's not an issue for us, and so I don't think we'd have to worry too much about that. And there's a provision in here about providing a list of access to areas that are needed each year, and so again, not something I think is relevant to us. So I think it's more the authority to enter into an agreement, the making sure there's a wall in terms of the relationship and the independence of the nonprofit from, in our case, the trust. There's a requirement about maintaining records of gifts, which a nonprofit has to do anyway, and OCF would be doing that already, or some other nonprofit. There's a provision in here about, there's a sort of a catch-all at the end that it doesn't affect the authority of the state agency at all to carry out their business. So again, just making sure that the authorities are clear between the state body and the nonprofit. So are there other things that folks think we might need if we're going to do a legislative fix to allow us to enter into agreements with a nonprofit? Other things we need to think about?
The only thing that kind of came to mind for me as you were going through that very special relationship between Oregon Parks Foundation and their department is that the agreement that we would have with a fiscal agent wouldn't require us to have authority to act on property or assets, but how I want to be mindful that there could be a potential for us to work with, I'm going to just throw out an example just for the sake of argument, say the Nearshore Research Station in Port Orford, which is an OSU asset. Do we need to consider that in this, at this time? One of the things that I heard this morning was that it can get sticky when you're purchasing, say, equipment or building an improvement onto a facility, and it may be that that's within the purview of OOST in the future. Is that it's kind of a front end and a back end situation, so I don't know if it murks things to contemplate it in this legislation.
So the question you're asking is whether we need some sort of statutory authority to do something like that.
Say it was ODF and W,
yeah.
Or probably might be more relevant with a state agency than with some other entity. So perhaps if there's language in there that gives the authority for the foundation to work on, or the trust in our case, to work on department, state department property or assets. I don't know.
Yeah, so I'm not, I guess I'm trying to figure out whether it would actually be the trust or doing that or a grantee of the trust.
I think that's the relationship that would happen, because unless that asset at OSU or ODFW was something that we had any kind of control over, I think that makes the difference.
And this is why I think we heard that the future would be to have the department just set up to write a grant to the foundation. And so I think as long as we're operating then in just as a grantor, that we don't run afoul of that. So
Yeah.
Right.
Or we could be the
Probably
grantee as well.
grant.
Because if there was a fund set up and we had a project that we wanted to direct the funds to, we could actually be the grantee or
Yeah.
receive some of the funds for admin costs, I believe.
Right. So I'm just thinking out loud. That seems consistent with the way that we intended to be set up as a pass-through, kind of in contrast to what we saw in California with more of a kind of a ownership approach. We just want to be a pass-through. So, all right.
Right. Any other thoughts? I mean, if we're going to open up the statutes, now's the time to fix things if there are things that need to be fixed. And one of the things, if we end up with a budget package, one of the things we may want to do is, while we're opening this up, is fix the executive director chair thing and turn what's now the executive director position into the chair of the trust and allow the trust to hire staff or contract for staff. We'll see whether we're going to end up with state funding that would allow us to do that. But
I have just a question, because I think this goes back to the very beginning of when we were set up. Was there ever a vision where the trust itself would be able to manage funds and that we would then become the entity that would do it, as opposed to having a relationship with a fiscal agent?
yes, so I think it was intended that at some point the state would appropriate a pile of money to us for a grant program, and we would administer those funds. We would not farm that out, although we certainly could, because there are lots of, whether it's Sea Grant or OWEB or other ODFW who have grant programs, we could decide it's easier, cheaper, more efficient to farm it out to some other organization. But I think the statute, the way it's currently constructed, anticipates that we would be doing that.
So are there any changes that need to reflect that potential role, which is what we were intending to do?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think we, the rules sort of laid out how we would approach that in terms of having a science review team, a technical review team, and then making decisions here. And, if we were doing, let's assume somehow we ended up with $3.5 million next biennium, $1 million of it from the state and $2.5 million from other sources to provide grants. And some of that's parked at the Oregon Community Foundation. I think we would solicit grants, put out RFPs, depending on the situation. We would review those proposals. We would likely fund some out of the state pot and send some to OCF for funding through the money that they've gotten in. So that's sort of how I had envisioned that. But there would be a single technical review process. We would make the decisions, directly fund some ourselves. And to be candid, DSL doesn't have staffing capacity to process those grants, so we'd have to figure out how that's going to happen, whether we're gonna, that would probably dictate that we'd have to have a staff person as opposed to a contractor who could do that. Probably housed within DSL or some state agency, likely here since we're appointed by the land board, but, and I don't, depending on volume of money and volume of proposals, you may need more than a FTE to actually do that, so. We could hope we have that problem.
Good problem.
Okay, anything else? So I'm gonna work with Senator Roblin's office and Representative Gomberg's office. Tyler, are you still listening in? Maybe not. But I'll work with them, and I think Senator Roblin
Hey
was
there. Yeah, I'm here. Sorry, it took me a minute to get off mute.
Okay. So, Tyler, do you know if a legislative placeholder has been put in by either your boss or Senator Roblin?
Senator Roblin's office does have a placeholder in place.
Okay, great. So I'll work with the two offices on how to move forward using parts of what's in the parks statute, and thinking about a couple of other things that we may want to do if there's actually going to be state funding coming to us next biennium. All right, so next up is public comment. Shelby? No? Okay. All right. So Karin is here, so why don't we jump into Karin's report?
Hardbound version.
Yes.
Hard copy, yeah, I've been perusing online.
We rate.
That is nice, I appreciate that.
Yes.
It's a
Yeah,
lot of
great.
letters and numbers
Thanks.
to track. 1.A.1
Okay. All right, great.
CB.
Organizing that was a monster.
I can imagine.
Various different
Oh, wow,
sizes
look at
of it. So we have the executive
It's got these
summary,
nice materials.
I like it.
feature, and
And the real
Look what happens when you get money.
I know, right?
Sorry if I keep bumping our table around.
Is that you?
Down here. There we go. Now I'll be a little less, every time I spin, I'm
Great, thanks.
knocking it around.
Welcome, Karin.
Thank you, all of you. It's nice to see you. And Karin, for the record, Karin Brady, Marine Manager for ODFW, and the lovely Charlotte Regula Whitefield, staff to the OAH Council, just handed you documents in person, and she and I are here to share with you what we've been up to with the OAH Council and how that connects with the OOST. And of course, you have among you the connecting member from the OOST to the OAH Council, Jim Sumich, who has been a great contribution to that group of 13 folks. I was appreciative of the length of time on your agenda that I was given. I don't need to take all of it, but I did want to start back at the beginning just because we can and we have a little bit of flexibility just for context setting. And so I'll start with just pointing to one of our native Oregonian species or types of species that's potentially negatively impacted by ocean acidification in particular, and that is the sea butterfly or pteropod that has been measured in the field and has been shown to have pitting in its shell during periods of acidification. So this is kind of my personal mascot as I think of this work and thinking of where are the places that we know there have been impacts. This is one of them, and I'll touch on several of them as I go through the slides. No. It still doesn't work. Yeah, but I have my handy technical assistant here. So, and as you know, I'll go through these quickly, but just again, just for the record, just for setting that context or resetting the context, in the West Coast shellfish aquaculture industry has been negatively impacted. It's valued in different ways by different people, different dollar signs, but $1 figure that has been repeated over and over, $270 million annually. That's not just Oregon, that's the Pacific Northwest as well, I believe, is some of the California contributions. That's a big impact for coastal communities. It's a big industry, and this is just one. Next. Next. And next. And there we go. Okay, it may have just taken, we might like pass through that one now. But you're all familiar with Whiskey Creek Shellfish Hatchery, which first started documenting failures in their hatchery productions in 2007. And so this is kind of the time point, the first time point for the ocean acidification story. And the shells on the right-hand side are baby oysters that were grown in normal and acidified conditions. Next. And then the pteropods, left, healthy, right, not so healthy. The pitting very evident in this photograph of wild-caught pteropods and the impacts on native species. The point being that the oyster industry has been able to mitigate the problems in their hatchery systems by controlling the water systems and modifying the chemistry to adapt, whereas the wild species have to adapt just on their own without our assistance. Next. One of the things that we've been doing on our road shows, so to speak, and sharing this information is just making sure that we talk about the connection between climate change and ocean acidification and hypoxia. And this figure has been very useful in having that conversation and just looking at that time frame of 400,000 years. And there are other data that extend back. They're based on the same type of analysis, which is looking at air pockets and ice cores and tracking that over time. But the recognition that in the last 200 years we've doubled what that maximum level is very impactful and really gives folks pause about where we are and what the challenge is. Next. And when you look at that box, next. We have our current patterns, and this is just the last 50 or so years, and the same trend, but slightly flatter because we've extended that x-axis timeline. Nothing you haven't seen. These are data from the atmosphere in the Hawaiian Islands area, one of our longest current data sets. Next. And when you look at dissolved carbon dioxide in the water, you see the same pattern. Next. And when you look at the pH of that water, it's the same trend, only negative due to the scale of pH. So this corroborating information or correlating information is really helpful in telling that story. And in talking with this group, I know that evidence is not necessarily needed, but in thinking about how you interact with folks and how messaging might be helpful for you, these kinds of visuals may be helpful in your own work. Next. I think a little bit further, go one more please, is thinking not only about the biological impacts of this transfer of atmospheric carbon dioxide to oceanic carbon dioxide and the biological impacts that have been experienced by the oyster industry, but next is the economic impacts, one more. And of great concern in the state are Dungeness crab and pink shrimp, which are two very important economic single species fisheries. Next. And then other fisheries like salmon and halibut. And there are probably a multitude of impacts of ocean acidification and hypoxia on these 4 single species in our fisheries portfolio, including food web impacts, larval growth and success impacts, behavioral impacts, and avoiding predators, seeking prey, finding home streams. And then in this last year, halibut really exhibited just a remarkable behavior in avoiding the hypoxia event that was occurring off the coast of Washington and extended across the entire continental shelf. And this was captured during the annual IPHC, or International Pacific Halibut Survey, that they do, where they're looking for halibut, but they also do basic oceanographic monitoring, and so they know the dissolved oxygen of each of their points of estimates of halibut. And what they found is the oxygen was really low and there were no halibut. And so putting those 2 pieces of information together, as well as trends over many years, you know, we think that halibut are mobile enough that they left the area. They're probably not dead, but our ability to assess them and to harvest them in a certain sustainable way is completely disrupted by this hypoxia event. Next. So that's context, and here is the 13-member council that is charged with honing in on specific science needs and policy recommendations for adaptation and mitigation. So like the Ocean Science Trust, this group was given a very tough task of trying to create a path for Oregon, and really happy that the bill connected the Ocean Science Trust and this body so that we can work together on finding those solutions. We, as you know, have finished our report, which is truly a set of recommendations from these 13 people. You know, we worked somewhat to come to work outside of that group, but it was really us coming to a common understanding and developing the action areas where we wanted to work, or where we felt there was potential to work. It needs to move from being a very long list of recommended action areas to actions that can get out on the ground or in the water and make a difference. And that's what the Oregon OAH action plan is hoped to be. And that action plan is targeted for completion next year. So of the 38 recommendations in here, maybe some of them, a small handful of those, maybe some that aren't even in the report, through public process, further input between now and next summer, will formulate a small, manageable set of actions that we can actually get our teeth into and do some work.
Karen, is that this same group?
It's a good question. The council will be involved in shaping it and designing the process and vetting the results from staff. Staff being Charlotte and myself, and Jack Barth as the co-chair of the council as well. And I say that because the first 8 months of the OAH council, we had monthly meetings interspersed with working group meetings. And I don't want to scare our council members away by expecting too much of them over the next year. It was very intensive. It was very successful and very good process. But I think we have to be realistic about what it is that we can achieve and how much we can depend on the council to be doing the public outreach and the public process. So Charlotte and I for sure, and then kind of policy oversight design by the council and vetting of the council afterwards. But it's not solid yet, and here's a preview. Our next meeting is a week from yesterday, so October 25th. We'll be talking to the council members about, okay, here's what we think the next year might look like. How does the council, individual council members want to be involved?
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, we don't know.
A really long answer.
But I understand. No, that's good. So there's
Yeah.
some an adaptation that may happen within
Yes.
these phases in order to make the next thing happen.
True.
Which is about a year from now is your deadline, so.
Yep. And Chris is pointing out that on the top row, fourth photo is Karen Tarno, who was at DEQ, and she is no longer on the council, but has been replaced by Jennifer Weigel, who has already been getting up to speed and will be participating in our meeting next week. Next. I think we tried to highlight pages in the report that give more information about each of these slides, just as a connecting thing for you, so that afterwards, if you're interested in digging in a particular area, you can do so. The council, in thinking about action areas of work focused on these 5 themes, the first is to strengthen OAH science monitoring and research. The second theme is to reduce causes of OAH. The third is to promote adaptation and resilience to OAH. The fourth is to raise awareness about the science, but also the impacts. And then lastly, what we're least prepared to talk about, but which we most need, is talking about the solutions. And then theme 5 is committing resources to OAH actions, which relates to the discussion you just had about, committing funding resources and institutional infrastructure to the OOST, to the council project ideas, and really kind of doing some of this work. Next. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, but each of the sections of the report that addresses each of these themes has kind of a purpose statement for each of the themes, and then is followed by a couple, 2 to 3 recommendations, and within each recommendation there are a couple of actions. So there's a transition from really high level conceptual description of what the council's interest was, down to a little bit more concrete, and what we need now over the next year is to take some of those action areas that are still fairly high level and try and hone them into real discrete projects. So theme 1, these are some areas for science, and those recommendations, so that kind of moderate level, focused on making sure we have a robust monitoring network, which I know resonates with the work that you all have done. Here. And then the second one is developing assessment and research plan. Again, resonates with this group, so that we have very well-honed ideas of what we want to do. The third area is developing research priorities specifically for mitigation alternatives. Next. So theme 2, which is reducing causes, is one where we need additional science, and we need additional commitment from the state to address the 2 areas where we saw a lot of potential. Was one in just kind of knitting together the work that the state's doing on carbon management, which includes, but is not exclusively, carbon cap and invest policy development, which is ongoing. It also includes taking a look at how we treat water policy in the state, and seeing where there are opportunities to value add rethink what we're doing in terms of our watersheds and pollutants that are potentially exacerbating ocean acidification and or hypoxia in our coastal waters and estuaries. Next. The third theme, promoting adaptation and resilience, we had two areas. One was to take a hard look at existing planning and decision-making frameworks. Another way of saying that maybe is having kind of a self-reflection and inventory process to say, okay, if we were going to do something about this as an agency, this is really focused largely on agencies, where would we fit it in? Because one of the problems that we have now is that there isn't, in the equation of managing natural resources, we don't have a place to put in ocean acidification and hypoxia risks or vulnerabilities or solutions. So trying to think about regulatory and non-regulatory ways that we can build that into decision making is that first recommendation. The second one is thinking about new resilience initiatives that are would require new regulation, new funding, new something completely different from what we're currently doing. And the focus there is really on native species resilience and community resilience and how to support both of those. Next. Theme 4 in raising awareness is kind of a two-part set of recommendations, and we had great leadership from Shelby Walker on this working group and this theme in general. So you have actually 3 council members in the chamber today who can speak to this whole body of work. And the first recommendation is focused on building the communication strategies. What are the messages? How do we message that? What are the important things to convey, and building in needs from public into the messages rather than just saying the council thinks the messages are X, Y, and Z, but really kind of building that collaboratively to have an effective way of talking about the science, which is we're pretty far along on, and the impacts to some degree, but we have some gaps, particularly in terms of economic impacts gaps. And then the solutions is the one that's really tough. The second recommendation is then thinking about specific audiences, and there are a lot of actions here and a lot of audience-specific thoughts from the council about what those audiences' role might be in thinking about these and thinking about OAH and their role in developing solutions. Next. And then theme 5, committing resources to action. The first one is really strengthening, the first recommendation is really to strengthen the policy framework. And while we have policy from the bill that created the OAH Council, it doesn't speak to what the state is going to do with the recommendations from the council. So it's committed to creating the council and taking recommendations, but not what it's going to do after that. And so kind of building in some expectations through policy, either from the legislature or from the governor, particularly related to agency workload, is the point of that first one. The second recommendation, which is very direct nexus in terms of infrastructure to the OOST, is diversifying the portfolio of funding sources and making sure that the entities in the state have the tools that they need in order to bring funding resources to the state's priorities, both the ones that are OOST specific, but also relative to this council, OOST specific that overlap with the OAH Council priorities in terms of actions, needs additional funding. The third one is recognizing the importance of Oregon's intellectual capacity on ocean acidification and hypoxia science, and the fact that our leading scientists are not just leaders within Oregon, but worldwide, and making sure that we have tools in place to continue that excellence. So things like fellowships and collaborations with researchers to continue developing that as a university priority within the state is a real long-term kind of goal. Next. So all of those actions and recommendations that the council went through a fairly rapid way of just valuing each action, each of the 38 actions. How important is this to you as a council member from your perspective? From that, we essentially ranked all 38 actions. It's not exactly a prioritization exercise, but it's getting towards that. And these 7 actions came forth. They covered all 5 of the themes. The first theme and the third theme have 2 actions listed, so they total 7. And this has been our kind of working list of talking to people about where the areas of common ground and thoughts about immediate actions for responding to this discussion we've had over the last year. Next. So I think the take home of this is that the connections to the OOST, both programmatically in terms of kind of areas of work that need to be done, and the strategic planning that you've done around what we need in monitoring and research and understanding, very similar and consistent and aligned with the Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Council. And so I appreciate the work that you've done previously, and I think that this adds and complements to where we are as a state. And I'd love to hear your thoughts of reactions and potential additional coordination and help that we can provide each other as we kind of move forward.
Thanks, Karen. Questions? Jim, do you want to add anything as a member of the coordinating council?
I think that Karen has done a good job of reviewing this. I think that we, as the OOST, needs to look at our priorities now that we have this in hand, and maybe do a little bit of adjusting there as we go forward on this.
So this was originally meant as a 2-year initiative then, just for this biennium? Or
That's a good question. The council is a standing body.
so it doesn't sunset after 2 years, it's out there, and it's just going to depend on additional funding to keep it going, or
Institutionally,
what does the future look like?
the council is staffed by, the council members are volunteers, but the bill provided us with an FTE, who is Charlotte. And so she and I are staff to the council.
But you have to ask for that funding again?
No.
For the
Permanent
next,
position.
Part of
it's
our base
permanent.
funding.
Oh, I'm sorry, I must have missed that. Okay.
It's part of our base funding. We do not have any funding to
Implement anything?
do any projects, which is a
But you're
common
setting
theme.
up the framework.
But we have the framework and we have the staff to coordinate and implement certainly a lot of outreach and coordination, but beyond that, doing the actual monitoring or holding major workshops, things like that, that's not something that we have the capacity to do through the bill.
We empathize.
Yes. No, it's excellent work. You did a lot
Yeah,
so far in
Yep.
a very short time.
yeah.
Thus the pause, the maybe slowed down schedule over the next few months, which I'm targeting Jim's eyes on because I want him to be assured that that we will have a different perspective moving forward.
Laura, were you?
Well, I think just maybe ask you to comment on what I kind of heard from Luis this morning, and I also experienced. I was invited last week to a Women in Climate Change meeting that was pulled together by TNC, and there were, I think, 60 or so women from many different backgrounds, from industry, oil and gas, science, nonprofits. And I too was rather surprised that I kind of felt like myself and a woman from Taylor Shellfish were the only ones in the room who really even thought about ocean acidification in the context of the global climate conversation that's happening. And then Luis also, I think, felt that at the economic summit there was very little given to ocean acidification. So I guess I just wondering, Karen, what do you see? Do you see that also? And maybe where can we take this to elevate the position of ocean acidification in the really big conversation?
Yeah, that's been an ongoing area of work for me individually, but for the region and for the representatives of the region within each of the jurisdictions. And the region that I'm talking about is the BC, Washington, Oregon, California region, which is tied together under the Pacific Coast Collaborative Governor's Level Agreement to work on climate and energy issues. And that group has a subcommittee on which I sit for representing Oregon to talk with the other jurisdictions about ocean acidification and hypoxia policy, science, coordination, and information priorities, information needs, and so on. That group has launched the Ocean Acidification Alliance, which I've mentioned to this group before. And that Ocean Acidification Alliance is a global entity that has a couple of key mandates. One is that in building a membership, government members commit to developing an ocean acidification action plan. So the action plan that I mentioned in this presentation is specifically relevant to Oregon, but it's also a part of our committed membership to the Ocean Acidification Alliance global community. Another key element of the PCC group and the Ocean Acidification Alliance is integrating oceans into climate discussions writ large. And so that group has been present and active at the last several COP meetings, including Paris, but Paris Forward, talking to other nations and subnations about oceans and how to talk about ocean impacts in terms of climate, and how to kind of harness the recognition that ocean acidification is a problem in elevating the purposes of the terrestrial and freshwater climate discussions, right? It's not only part of the impact story, and we need to figure out solutions, but it's also part of the rationale for taking action. And so that, as you recognize, it's a hard go. I mean, it's been a climate discussion that has focused on terrestrial and freshwater impacts for decades. And for whatever reason, oceans wasn't a part of that original conversation. And so now kind of finding a niche and, you know, building that into the existing conversation is slow. But there's a lot of receptivity, and you can probably guess the folks who are most interested. It's coastal states, it's coastal nations, it's Pacific islands, you know, the list goes on, and it's a recognition that it's not just air, terrestrial, freshwater, that the ocean is huge in terms of being a carbon sink, but also being sustaining for economies and ecosystem health generally, and that it's all part of the problem and the solution.
Yeah, well, this will be an interesting challenge for what Shelby, thankfully is really engaged in terms of the communication piece of this. Because it's, monitoring, assessment, research, yes, but, just how we communicate and raise awareness is as important as well, so.
Within the state of Oregon, we have the Oregon Global Warming Commission, and they just met earlier this week. So Charlotte and Jack Barth and I were up in Portland on Tuesday talking to them, and that is a body that we see as being key to kind of aligning the ocean policy and the terrestrial carbon policy in the state, just through interaction, just sharing information, integrating some of their messaging within ours, providing information, providing messaging to them, so that we're speaking with one voice on these issues in a coordinated way. So,
do you know if this is going to be a topic at the next COP in December?
It will be. I don't know exactly what that will look like, but Oceans has been there in a number of ways. The last COP meeting, we had an Ocean Acidification Alliance event, and I haven't ever participated in a COP meeting, but the way it's been described to me is that there's plenary sessions and there's all these side events and side halls and stuff happening, and it's lots of things happening at any given point in time. The Ocean Acidification Alliance has had, I think, 2 years in a row side events. This last one was in Bonn, was very well attended, had multiple representatives, governors and nations attending, and we will continue to ask for and participate in space given to oceans at the next one. I think the one coming up in Poland is expected to be maybe not quite as developed as the one in Bonn, and maybe this will be a quieter COP meeting. They kind of oscillate. But we do still plan to have somebody there.
Other questions? Thanks, Karen.
Thanks.
Thank you for all the work you do.
Yeah.
And Charlotte,
Charlotte.
and Andy, and Shelby, and Jim.
Yes.
Now you have 4 of us.
Yes.
With Andy.
Yeah. Okay, let's take a 15-minute break, come back at 5 minutes to 11,
All right.
and we'll finish our agenda.
I had my agenda and a piece of paper that had some old notes on it, and I didn't know
Totally
if it got,
gone.
or if you didn't get into your shuffle. That was what I was looking for, the old pilot projects list.
I saw it, and I knew you were looking for it, but I wasn't gonna shout while everybody's like, hey, it's right there.
That's hilarious. I do this all day long.
one thing I meant to mention, just in terms of updates, Representative Bonamici, along with Congressman Young from Alaska and Congressman Posey from Florida, have introduced the Coastal and Ocean Acidification Stressors and Threats Research Act, which I think previously existed and was funded with funding that sunsetted in 2012, if I remember correctly. So they have reintroduced this concept and are looking to get funding made available for research related to ocean acidification. I don't know what the likelihood is. I also understand that a separate bill has been introduced in Congress on harmful algal blooms, also by another set of congressional folks. And it sounded like maybe the HAB bill had a better chance than this one. Last I talked to someone, so there are efforts underway, and they are bi-coastal and bipartisan to get funding available, made available from the federal government to help with ocean issues related to climate change. So we'll see if anything comes of that, but be nice if there was a federal pot of money we could apply for once we had some state funds.
Can I ask for clarification like I always do, because I can't seem to keep track of this legislative calendar in my head. Can you help me just like next year as this moves through, what are those month touch points for us where we'll have more information?
Okay, so the DAS appeal process is underway right now. DSL had their appeal hearing yesterday, day before yesterday, with Legislative Fiscal Office. Now, Legislative Fiscal Office will work with the Governor's Office on a Governor's recommended budget, which is published on December 1st. So we'll know, we'll probably know before December 1st, but we'll know officially by December 1st whether we're included in the Governor's recommended budget. Session opens the second week of January, first week of January, and then they go home. They come in for 3 days to set up process and procedures, and then they go home until the first week of February. And then starting right out of the gate in February, committees will be meeting and processing things. And DSL's budget, the last couple of sessions has sort of been in the middle of the scheduling of the natural resource agencies and the natural resource subcommittee. So I don't know whether that'll change or not.
Yeah, and I can send, we can send the legislative calendar to the OOST members if you want to see that. Obviously, our budget's not scheduled yet, but if you just want to see how it breaks down between when the session kicks off and when bills need to make it through chambers and such.
The legislators have a deadline by which they have to put bills in. Tyler, are you still on the phone?
Yes, I'm here.
So what's your drop dead date for putting in legislative concepts for next session?
Our draft request deadline was September 28th.
Okay.
So as far as the legislative fix that we need to go into agreement with OCF, that won't shake out until the session.
So I think Senator Roblin actually put a placeholder bill in, so there's a draft that's been sent down to Leg Council, and we'll have the ability to amend that as needed.
Yes, that's correct.
So we've covered the bases in terms of having something in the hopper. And that all, so a bill like that will go to a substantive committee, not to, will go to a policy committee, not to Ways and Means, and probably Environment and Natural Resources in the Senate side, and I don't know who gets
Either
ocean bills, Energy and
Energy and
Environment.
Environment, probably be my guess.
Or Ag and
or
Forest.
Ag, yeah,
Yeah, I can't imagine it go to Ag and Forestry, but maybe.
So if that were approved, it would be at what point next year? Would that be potentially?
So probably, well, I don't know how fast things can
Yeah,
happen.
okay.
It depends on what the how many bills they're trying to get through. My guess is we're not going to know anything. We will not know everything until they go home in July. We certainly won't know about funding because I imagine that will be part of the end game discussion. If it's not in the governor's recommended budget and they're working with Senator Roblin's bill that for $5 million for us, that's a discussion that's likely to take place at in the Christmas tree bill, not in the agency's bill. It probably, because it's general fund. So my guess is we won't know the results of the legislation might go sooner, but the Ways and Means process, I would guess, would be very late in the discussion.
So we would still be out after that under even an emergency rule another couple of months. So it's coming back to me now. We talked about this last time, so I'm sorry.
That's all right. That's all right.
Every time.
Yeah, that's all right.
But it would be fall of next year, if all goes well, that we would be in a position to go into that kind of an OCF agreement if everything goes
Yes.
as planned. Okay.
Yes.
That's what I was
Well, and you need an emergency clause on the legislation in order for us to be able to do it that quickly.
Yeah.
Bills normally don't go into effect until January of the following, for this session would be 2020. So under a normal circumstance, you wouldn't even be able to enter into it until 2020.
Okay. Thank you for that
Yeah.
recap.
Yeah, glad to do it.
Not
very
commit
helpful.
that to memory
Yeah.
probably, but
Yeah, it's all right.
just wanted
Unless
to-
you live the process several years, it's hard to remember
Yeah,
when,
yeah,
what
okay.
happens.
I just had my appeal
Oh, did
at
you?
the Gorge Commission.
Yeah. All right, so we have a vacancy, and I think, I don't know if it was land board staff or DSL staff who sort of tossed this back to us to try and see if we could come up with a person or a list of people that we might suggest. And keep in mind that Emily's background was really the private foundation world. And it would be good to continue to have that kind of connection on the trust. I don't know a lot of those. I mean, I know some of the folks that we've been meeting with, but they're not likely potential members of the trust because they're program officers who are making decisions on grants for their foundations. But somebody who was in the foundation world and isn't anymore would be really good. I don't know. Christina, if you
Yeah, I
still,
do.
okay.
But I was wondering what the process should be. Do you want to have us have like a nominating committee, or do we just give you names now and explore with those people? How would you like to handle it?
So I think we should get a list of names. I can talk to them initially, but ultimately it's the land board's decision. And I know when we all were brought on, it was the governor's natural resource advisor who did the vetting and made the ultimate decisions about who to recommend to the land board. And it came in as a agenda item actually from the governor's office, I think, to the land board in that case. Or maybe it was DSL
Yeah,
staff
it was an
ultimately.
agency.
Okay.
I did the agenda item, but you're
Okay.
right, it was Gabriella who kind of did the.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, and I was actually hoping that that's how that would, it would happen, that they would do that, but I think it sort of got, they want us to start with
Yeah.
With at
who
least
they
some
don't want to,
nominations?
yes,
Okay.
yeah, so if we've got ideas for who, and if you know, Christine, if you've got some ideas and you want to talk to them first to see if they have any interest, that's fine with me. And I don't know if others have people, and it, you know, it could be somebody who doesn't have foundation world contacts, but I do think that there's an advantage to having that going forward, but.
And if there was any sort of blurb you wanted us to put on the web page and have people email to us for us to just distribute, they're like,
Oh, well,
email
that
us
would
with
be good that there's a
interest and we can-
vacancy, and if there's anybody interested out there.
We can put it on the listserv as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just, there's a list in the statute of the kinds of qualifications that people need to have, so it would be good to attach that, so that we don't get a whole lot of people applying who don't have, because it's something like 3 to 5 years experience in one or more of the following areas or something. So you have to have some background related to what we're doing in some way, shape, or form, so.
And this is tentatively on the December
Yeah, so I don't know that we'll have somebody to fill the vacancy. You're gonna do the reappointment
Yeah,
of
we'll
Jim for
reappoint Jim.
sure. And whether we have somebody ready to go by the December land board, we'll see.
Yeah.
Is Jim rotating now?
No, he's
Sorry?
continuing.
Oh,
He's
good.
going to get reappointed
Oh, good. Oh, good.
to a second
I just
term,
got
a
worried
four-year
there
term.
for a minute.
No, no. Now, he did ask whether I thought it was time to make a change, and I said, no.
No. That's unanimous.
So Louise, if you want, I bet we could even run it by somebody in HR to help us come up with like just a brief announcement, and you could look at it, and we could post it on the website, send it to
Okay,
listservs,
let's do that.
including to make
OPAC,
sure it gets
yeah, we
to
could send it out to
Andy.
OPAC, yeah, that would
Okay.
be great.
We'll do that.
All right,
Super.
so are you gonna collect all those here, or is that the way you're gonna do it, or you wanna send them to me? What do you wanna do?
We could do that, we could
Yeah.
have them sent to me and
Okay.
I'll get them to you,
Okay, all right,
since our names are on the website.
okay, all right,
Sure.
all right.
With that said, then we'd probably keep it open for a specific amount of time, and then
Yeah.
just let you know what we have, and then if you wanted to reopen it, we could do that.
So when do you have need to have your December land board items done? This week?
It seems like it's earlier
Yes.
and earlier every time.
Actually, I think it's next week, but if we put a placeholder in it,
Well, you will have, because you'll have for Jim, and it's
I've
just
already
a matter of
written. I've
whether.
already written his
Okay, so we
land
can
portion
just
down.
add it to
this is
the,
already in.
Yeah.
okay, we can just add it to that if we have somebody ready to go by then.
Yeah.
All right, all right,
And then we can email back and forth or talk on the phone between Chris and I and you, as
Okay.
far as the announcement stuff goes.
okay. And Chris, do you think I should talk to Jason? I don't want to get crosswise with land board folks and just come up with somebody and recommend them, but I don't know what the process is
me-
these days.
Do you wanna reach
How-
out to Jason and see? what
Yeah,
preference is?
I could do that. I could reach out to him. But I think I'd probably just start by telling him we're going to do this announcement, and then pull him in
Okay,
later
okay.
as we get closer.
I mean, yeah, the question is how involved they want to be in making this decision. I mean, do they just want us to come up with somebody that we think would be good and recommend them and they'll approve them, or do they want to have some vetting process for the person or
So-
for a couple people?
I haven't had any, substantive discussions with Jason Minor with regards to this
This.
vacancy. I did talk to his assistant to confirm it's not an executive appointment, so it does not need to go
Right.
through that. It's a land board
Right,
decision, so.
right. Okay. So you're going to talk to Jason about how
Sure.
involved he wants to be or not. Okay, so the next item so Jim, when we left the last meeting, Jim was going to take a stab at doing some editing, which he did, and got to me. And I got waylaid by an emergency situation in our CASA program in Lincoln County, which I'm also involved in, and just never got back to editing that document. I have had a couple of conversations with folks in light of the public comment that we got last month about connecting with recreational folks and some of their concerns. One of the things I've heard back pretty strongly is that we should include the Marine Reserve review on that project description, particularly list of pilot projects, particularly because given the timing of everything, if we're not getting money until, next year sometime or the following year, the review is coming up in 2023. So it's probably important to put that on there and just describe, because we've been approached by folks on the stack for OPAC about the potential for OOS to actually take the lead role in soliciting a proposal to do the review, because it has to be an Oregon university, I think. Is it Oregon University? Can it be an out-of-state university? Do you know, Andy? I can't remember how that's written, but it's supposed to be a university who's going to do the review, and so because STAC has so many university folks on it, would be a conflict of interest for them to try and run that RFP and make that decision. So they are hoping that OOST might play that role of leading that review and putting out the RFP to get that review done. Again, the statute says there to be no additional money appropriated to do the review, which is where we might be able to come in and help if we got either something at OCF set up or we got state grant funds, although maybe because of the way that legislation's written, we can't use those state funds even if we got them, but we'd have to check on that. So anyway, I think putting that piece on that project list makes a lot of sense. And the other thing I had actually started working on but didn't get finished is to add in sort of when I originally drafted that, I really drafted it on targeted at commercial species, and so I trying to add in the recreational pieces to that, particularly with regard to abalone and crab, and I mean there's a lot of those projects that do impact or have the potential impact recreational fisheries and recreational uses of the ocean. So trying to add that piece in there. I didn't hear from the folks I talked to some urgent need to focus on the water quality issue, which was one of the things that I think Gina Carter had mentioned in her comments last meeting. So I didn't get that feedback from folks that would take priority over the other projects that are on the list. So other than the Marine Reserve one needing to be added and continuing to do the editing and making sure that we're covering not just commercial uses but the recreational uses as well, I think we'll end up with a pretty decent project. I've also gotten some feedback on some of the dollar amounts. After a conversation with Andy, I doubled the amount we need for the mapping tool for what people are seeing out in the ocean, because you got to build the system and then you got to maintain it. So increase the funding for that. And I'm talking to Shelby about the couple projects that the scientists and the fishermen folks came up with jointly about the amount of money that I just ballparked for those, and trying to get a better number on those. So still working on trying to get better numbers for that. One thing, sort of aside from this, Laura, you had started working with Surfrider on the one-pagers, and it's, I got asked today by Vicki about if there's a one-pager that describes the trust, who we are and what we're doing, and we don't have one that's sort of ready to go. And Chris, I was sort of thinking during this meeting it would be great if the DSL communications person could sort of take the stuff that's on the website and put it on a fact sheet similar to the other fact sheets that the agency has. You know, how we're created, what the purposes are, who the members are. It doesn't need to be elaborate. You know, the key priority questions. I mean, it's a cut and paste and putting some nice photos on. And I don't know about that person's time constraints. I don't know what their workload is, but if there would be a way to do that, to get that one pager available particularly for legislators, would be good to have. I think that's a good idea, and I think we can probably, that shouldn't take too much time, but I'll certainly check with our communications everything
manager.
that needs to go on there is available, and it's just a matter of.
Well, I think that was, you know, kind of in the rough drafts
Right.
of what Surfrider
Yes.
did, and they were trying to provide a template
Yep.
that had that cut and paste
Yes.
with the priorities. Where we weren't ready to go yet was the projects.
Right.
So I don't know.
And I
if
think
you
we
could
can leave
just
the projects
pick up
off.
where
Yeah.
they left off, because I don't know if others had any strong sentiment, but the formatting and the template was it was attractive and
Yeah.
easy to read, so that would reduce the amount of time. And
And my understanding was that Surfrider just handed that over to us. They don't feel any sense of ownership over that. It was just something they wanted to contribute some resources
Oh,
to.
was
So
that at our
some-
March meeting?
So we have those electronic files, we got them for that meeting, so I can't remember which meeting that was.
Yeah,
Okay.
they were in PDF form. I could always request that in the original Illustrator file or whatever the department uses for doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll look back. I'm having this mouse is not working too good, but I'll take a look back at our meeting materials and see if I can find it, and if not, we can reach out to Charlie.
If you recall, there were 3 versions.
Yeah, so there are 3 versions of them, they're just one-pagers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to just go with the one that's the most general and maybe for the legislative audiences.
I have them, and we have the ability to manipulate
Yeah.
and edit PDFs.
Good.
So I can open them and then we can just use our in-house, designing whatever our communications person uses and go from there.
Yeah, I mean, there's some nice photos on here that they had pulled in, and so I think if we could just get one that is something that Vicky can use with legislators and I can use with legislators, and we can just put up on the website for the general public, I think that would be useful.
Sounds good.
Great. Okay, so timing of next meeting. So I think I'd want to wait until we get a couple months into the session. I don't know if people are feeling that there's something more urgent to do, but I'd like to get some sense of where things might be headed legislatively before we meet again.
So are you thinking April or?
Yeah, March or April maybe.
I can send out a poll and see people's availability for March, April.
Okay, are folks feeling a need to meet sooner than that for any particular purpose?
Is there anything we need to do related to the legislation?
I
Or
don't
is that
think
something
so.
through
I think,
email
yeah, I think I'll work with Roland's office on the placeholder that they put in and make sure it's headed in the right direction for us. And the budget stuff DSL is handling, and we'll find out about that.
Yeah, we'll keep you in
soon.
the loop when we find out.
Right. And during session, when whether it's the legislation or budget stuff come up, I'll plan to be in town to testify or provide backup to DSL on testifying. But I can't think of anything that we'd need to do, any action we'd need to take at this point.
I guess my only kind of desire in terms of moving process forward is related to the identification of the projects. Some of the feedback that I had heard was let me go back a step. So this morning in hearing from Lisa, emphasizing the importance of mutually agreed upon projects and goals. And I didn't, some of the feedback that I got from some public was that these weren't aligned with what they would consider to be priority projects. So I wonder if there's more work to be done there in the meantime, but on the other hand, I don't want to devise something really specific right now if we're not in a position to act for another 12 months.
Yeah, which is why I wasn't in a hurry, didn't feel a sense of urgency to get that done.
So it may not be that we have to do this in the next 3 or 4 months, but I feel like there's an amount of work that needs to be done here, not just within our trust members, but with our potential partners, be they potential funders or recipients, to make this alignment happen. I think it will
ultimately help us be more successful. And I think that Louise, what you put together here was a really good first run. I'll be interested to see what Jim, because we had a pretty good discussion at the last meeting, what a second run looks like, but there's gonna need to be some process there.
Yeah, and Jim tried to take the abalone item and merge it with the mapping tool item, and I think he expressed some frustration to me after he tried to do that it wasn't quite so easy. Yeah, it didn't fit exactly well, so I think there's some work to be done there. I'm curious, Laura, did the folks you talked to talk about specific things that they'd like to see that aren't there?
I think that was kind of where I scratched my head. I didn't get specifics.
Okay.
I just heard these look like very commercial fishing focused, or these were things that came out of the Sea Grant meetings, or that maybe their interests weren't here. But no, I did not get a list of what that looks like, and that's where I want to get to is what's missing here.
Well, so there's a couple ways to come at that. One is we could send out to folks on our list and the OPAC list. This document is a draft, and ask for feedback and ask for suggestions for projects that aren't here that they think should be high priority for us. We could not send out a list at all and just solicit ideas for early ready-to-go projects, so that should we get funding, we actually have a list of projects ready to go. We could hold a meeting for the sole purpose of getting folks to come. We could invite panels of people to come talk to us. I mean, there's a number of ways you could do a process to get a broader group of folks participating. The only recreational group who provided input into that before it was drafted was Surfrider, and the abalone project came from them. The other one that they put in, which was mussels, after talking to ODFW, they gave a much higher priority to the abalone than the mussel project, and so I didn't use the mussel project. Gina talked about the water quality piece. I can't find anybody who thinks that that's. I'm not sure what the projects, and that's why I asked if you had heard what the projects are. I've heard the general comment more than once about this has come from the commercial fishing, discussions with the commercial fishing industry. Yeah. So what do you want to add? And I don't have it. Haven't gotten any specifics. So we can set up a process to try and get at that.
Yeah, I think OPAC would be a good place to start there.
Well, yeah, although I don't know that OPAC is I'd use the OPAC email list to send it out to. I don't know that we'd use OPAC meeting time to try and do something that's our work, but.
Well, we recently have experience putting, reports or papers up on the website and then soliciting feedback. We have a feedback button. We just did it for the Elliott State Forest Assessment Report.
Right.
So that's an easy one for us to assist you with.
Okay.
If you want to put your draft list up there and send some emails out to the listservs in the interim.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say the conversation that is the hardest to get in the room and to have is really with who would fund these projects. And I don't know if that's just by virtue of geography, that money isn't always here within the state. But I guess the question that has been posed to me and that I ask is, when we do go out, when we do have the opportunity to solicit private donor funds, what do they want to fund, and how does that look when we filter it through the priorities that we set up? Because we're the trusted filter. That's
Right.
in my opinion, our main purpose is to be that review and filter to make sure that the tail's not wagging the dog. So, but we have yet to really have that conversation. And I'm not saying that it's easy just to get the ear of those people and get them in the room.
So I think there's different answers to that question depending on what we're talking about funding. I think if we're talking, I'll use this, if we're talking about funding the review of the marine reserves, I think there are specific foundations who are interested in funding that, Packard in particular, and there may be others. When it comes to the commercial fisheries piece, I think that's a tougher stretch for private foundations. So that may be where state funds need to come in to do those projects. So I think it's project specific. I think as an entity, we need to be careful about trying to fit ourselves into the box of a foundation. Absolutely. I think we need to set our priorities and go to foundations and say, we have 6 priority projects or 10 priority projects. In reviewing this list, are there any that you think fit within your mission, your goals that you're trying to achieve with your funding? And if so, see if, we're invited to submit a full-blown proposal to get those funded through those particular organizations. So, and I know there's this negative connotation that comes with seeking funding from certain foundations who have funded other things that people don't like that they got funded. But boy, in this kind of world, I don't think you can be choosy about where you're soliciting funds from. And I think we were created so that we could do this, that we could get the funds, and that we're making the decisions about what's getting funded. And we'll go to the appropriate funders to get that funded. And it's not the funders who are directing our work or advocating for us to do a particular piece of work.
Right. No, I'm very sensitive to that. Yeah. It's a nuance, really.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And perception. So, so I guess my point being, we have some more communication to do with defining the projects and when's the right time to do that. Right. And you were suggesting, did you suggest April?
Yeah.
As the next time to meet?
And so maybe, we set up a process where for a month we solicit ideas from people for pilot projects and then come in April or March and have a discussion. Here's the list of things that came in through the solicitation, and look at those and try and vet those and prioritize them and decide, hey, we want to have a list of, 5 or 10 projects that we think are the most important to fund out of the gate once we have funding.
Yeah, and I mean, not to open up a whole can of worms here, but
you can do a conversation up and down the coast. We can hold a meeting in every county and solicit input that way. But another approach, and I say this not advocating this approach, but just suggesting this approach, is what I see coming out of the Ocean Acidification Hypoxia Council, which is a more broad brush in terms of a recommendation and a request for funding without a specific. We're pretty specific in what the draft pilot projects are right now, and whether we go more broadly back to our the key questions,
the key questions, priorities, guiding principles. I can't remember exactly how we term them. But I'm more than fine because of the limitations that we have right now with doing that at an April meeting. But I think we need to put some thought into to that, do you see, do other trust members think there would be any benefit or risk to kind of coming up a notch in terms of the resolution of what we're asking for out of a pilot project?
I think it would be beneficial. I think it gives us more flexibility when we start looking at potential funders, so that we're not so narrowly focused.
Well, we want to be compelling. We don't want to be
Right,
so
but I don't think
baseline that you're not saying what you're
Well,
going to
We
do.
have
Well,
to tell a story.
okay.
with those.
we may not be the group that initiates and defines those specific projects. We need input from people that know more about some of this stuff than we do.
Right. So, well, so,
And so if we can keep a broader umbrella
right,
for defining that, I think we'd be better off.
yeah, okay. So here's another way to go about this is to post the priority questions again, and indicate to folks that we're trying to identify priority projects or priority research concepts or monitoring that would need to be done to answer those questions, and begin to fill in under each of those questions a couple of priority projects, as opposed to sort of this standalone, how does this connect with the key questions you're trying to answer? So it's a different way to go about it.
How is that different than the pilot project descriptions?
So the pilot project descriptions really didn't come out of any discussion around our key questions, our priority questions. They're just projects that have been discussed in other forums.
I see. Got it. That's right.
So,
Thanks for that reminder.
yeah.
Because we've done quite a bit of work already through that science summit that we had. And
Right.
Yes, so that's why I'm
there's a lot of-
suggesting maybe we go back to that
Yeah.
and take those key questions. And, you know, we know that we want to build a line, we want to replicate the Newport line in 4 other places. You know, so we know that's one of our high priority projects.
And I think we identified that a data portal, which we call a mapping tool here,
Yes.
but we also called a data portal, really touches on at least 3, maybe even more of the projects here. So maybe that's one that can be lifted. And how that data portal is used could be very different for the commercial fishing industry, the recreational interests, et cetera.
Right.
What about linking it also providing some support for the ocean acidification efforts?
Yeah, so.
Because that's a priority for us as well.
Right, so they're gonna now take this report and convert it into an action plan. So there'll be some pretty specific actions that'll be called out. A group of them will be monitoring research projects, and so it seems to me that, you know, one of the things we wanna have as a high priority is getting those projects funded, around OAH. But there's also HABs and other issues that we may want to have projects address as well. So I think it's going to come from a number of places, but I think getting input from, though not all those forums have opportunity for the broader public to provide input. So.
Well, I think it would be good to have that discussion in April.
Okay, so have the discussion about how to do that, or do something between now and then that feeds into a discussion in April?
The latter. I think that we need to go back to those key questions, kind of rethink this a little bit, and so at least we come into April with some fairly well-worked ideas.
Okay. So how about if I work with DSL staff? I'll craft a, you know, request for feedback using the 5 questions and trying to describe what we're trying to get to in terms of, you know, if we get funding, what are the highest priorities for funding? and we can just send it out to our list and the OPAC list and see what we get back. And I can have Shelby send it out to the Sea Grant list also, so we get academic input as well. Your list go out to the STAC folks? Your listserv include the STAC folks, or are they separate?
Doesn't, but we could.
Okay.
So as those come in, they would just be,
Yep.
staff would be responsible for
Yeah, we can compile them,
consolidating
yeah.
that and then just
And-
handing
yeah.
it off to us, and we can take that body into consideration as we try to be strategic about tying projects to the work that we've already agreed to.
Yep.
Okay.
So at this point, what I'm hearing is I'm gonna stop working on this draft pilot project list for now. It won't go away. We'll see what we get in the door from this solicitation, and then revisit it and figure out, you know, are there things we want to drop off that list, things we want to add to it based on the feedback we get. Does that make sense?
Yes,
Okay.
I like it.
So late March, early April, and for next
Yes.
meeting, and focused on this discussion for sure. One of the other things that was recommended at the last meeting is at some point we have a panel of foundation folks come in. I'm not sure we're ready for that yet, so I'm going to sort of keep that out there as a potential agenda item for some point in the future.
Let's see how we do with the legislature.
Yeah, and then we'll get a legislative update in April, and I'll assume the legislators can't be here, so we'll rely on, Chris, are you doing legislative coordinator stuff?
I probably won't be doing the
Okay.
legislative coordinator stuff, but
Okay.
but I can certainly help out
Whoever
with
at
those.
DSL is doing, who's going to do it?
I don't know yet.
Okay, so,
I'm not going anywhere, so we'll figure it out.
yeah, okay, all right,
Or at least I'm not planning
all right.
to.
So anyway, we can get a legislative update, and as I said, I'll track stuff during session. I'll get signed up on the website to track any specific bills that involve us and the Ways and Means process as well, so. Okay, anything else for the good of the order today? All right,
Thank you.
thanks. We're adjourned,
Thank you.
early.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tyler.
Being on the phone.